Welcome to What the F is Going On in Latin America and the Caribbean, a popular resistance broadcast in partnership with Black Alliance for Peace, Haiti America's team, Code Pink, Council on Hemispheric Affairs, Common Frontiers, Friends of Latin America, Interreligious Task Force on Central America, Massachusetts Peace Action, and Task Force on the Americas. We broadcast every Thursday, 7:30 p.m. Eastern, right here on YouTube Live, simultaneously on 3 YouTube channels, Code Pink, Common Front, Convo Couch, and Popular Resistance. Post-broadcast recordings can be found at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. So everyone, today I'm really happy to have a personal friend and wonderful journalist from Venezuela join us. Ricardo Vaz. He is a political analyst and editor at Venezuela Analysis. He is going to be joining us live from Caracas for this episode. And before I have him join the conversation, let me give all of you a bit of background as to what we're going to be talking about in this episode. So here we go. And I will also add, I guess I should just tell you what I'm going to share with you is actually text from an article published in Venezuela Analysis this week, and I will be sure to have that link in the program notes for all of you. So here's a bit of background. Venezuela President Nicolás Maduro traveled to Brazil as part of an official visit to meet with his counterpart, Lula da Silva, where the pair discussed regional and international cooperation, including the potential entry of Venezuela into the BRICS bloc. This is the financial bloc of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. The high-level meeting comes as part of joint efforts to strengthen their bilateral ties following the restoration of diplomatic and economic relations after years of tension under Lula's predecessor, Jair Bolsonaro, who embraced Washington's regime change plots against Maduro and backed the so-called interim government of opposition figure Juan Guaidó. Monday's bilateral meeting also focused on reactivating trade between the two countries, which fell precipitously after Bolsonaro's recognition of Guaidó, severely impacting populations on both sides of the Venezuela-Brazil border. The pair also discussed efforts to advance regional integration. Regional integration, as the audience knows, is a recurring theme throughout Latin America and the Caribbean in the last several years. So welcome, Ricardo. Wonderful to have you with us. Finally, as you said before we went live, Karen, we were wondering when Venezuela Analysis was going to come on the show. So here you are, and I'm so thankful you had time to join us. And just to, again, for the audience, Ricardo's joining us live from Caracas for this episode. So we're really pleased to have you with us. So maybe
it's great.
We should start with the historical context of this meeting, give the audience a bit of background as to why Monday's meeting was so incredibly exciting and significant, not just for Brazil and Venezuela, but for the region as a whole, and perhaps the global South as a whole.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first of all, thanks for the invitation. We are big fans of the podcast, and we're thrilled to finally be here. We hope
well, we're big fans of Venezuela Analysis. So.
And also great to see. I mean, we're used to seeing each other in Caracas. I think this is the first time we do a webinar like this.
Yeah, it's true. It's great.
So to give a bit of let's say near past context and then distant past context, it's very tempting to say that this is the end of the plan to isolate Venezuela. We might have declared it a few times in the recent past. But I mean, just to make a quick recap, Venezuela was turned into a bit of a pariah state by these efforts led by the United States, of course. They weren't nearly, they weren't ever close to reaching its goal, which was to ultimately oust the Maduro government. But it actually did succeed in kind of isolating Venezuela in the international arena. Venezuela wasn't exactly, I mean, the Maduro government wasn't exactly replaced by this, make-believe Guaidó, quote-unquote, interim government, because, in multilateral forums, they weren't just going to allow for this kind of circus. I mean, I think the OAS was the only exception. But then gradually, as this interim government became more and more of a farce, more countries started to realize that there was no reason to continue playing along. And so step by step, there's a kind of diplomatic re-entry of Venezuela in the global arena. So when we're talking about Maduro trips abroad, there I wrote them down so I don't remember, so I don't forget. The first one was in September 2021, and this was very controversial for the corporate media because Maduro went to this CELAC summit in Mexico, and Maduro actually welcomes this kind of confrontation. I remember that the presidents of Uruguay and Paraguay thought this was their chance to kind of, please their
and they did. They were very overt, like across the table. Like just because we're in this room together doesn't mean we support you.
And Maduro said, I mean, if you want to debate, just set the time and place. I'm welcome to do it. So he was really spreading his diplomatic wings. Of course, Maduro, we should remember, was Chavez's foreign minister for a long time. So he's no foreigner, quote unquote, to these kinds of settings.
You know what?
Go ahead.
It's great that you reiterate to all of us that Maduro was Chavez's foreign minister, because in the United States, he is consistently referred to as a bus driver, which he was, a labor organizer, but it's rarely, if ever, mentioned that he served as foreign minister, which is significant. It's a significant omission, and it's a significant, part of his resume.
Yeah, it's significant, and it's not innocent, right? I mean, it's part of the picture that these outlets want to paint about Maduro. So then the next significant step, I would say, mid last year, you'll remember very well, there was this, let's say, less than successful Summit of the Americas in Los Angeles, where there was this whole controversy of whether Cuba and Venezuela and Nicaragua were going to be invited or not. In the end, Biden just stuck to this hardline position, and it led to the summit being boycotted by a lot of other regional leaders, including, perhaps the highest profile was Mexico's AMLO, who didn't show up. So simultaneously with the Summit of the Americas, Maduro went on a tour that had stops in Algeria, Iran, Turkey, Gulf countries, and this was his way of showing that, maybe Biden will not invite him, but that does not mean that, I'm not recognized in other places. And here we're talking about countries that have significance when we're talking about global energy markets and all that. Then a few months later, Maduro went to COP27, the summit in Egypt, which isn't the most, I'm going to be a bit politically incorrect. I mean, like most United Nations initiatives, it's not the most useful thing in the world. But for Maduro, it was, because it actually showed him on this first global stage. And there was, you'll remember, this highly choreographed handshake with Emmanuel Macron of France in the hallway. And this was perhaps the first time where he was face-to-face with an European leader who had publicly hosted Guaidó in the past. So it was kind of, let's say, an elegant way for Macron to kind of resume normal diplomacy and abandon the previous fantasy. Then there was kind of, between then and now, the most significant development was Petro's election in Brazil, in Colombia. Sorry. Colombia. And he was very swift in reestablishing diplomatic relations with Venezuela, and reopening the border, in returning monomers, which is an agrochemical producer that had been seized by the Colombian government. It was returned to the Venezuelan state. And then he came to Caracas, if I'm not mistaken, in November last year. And then finally, we got to this point just a few days ago, when Maduro visited Brazil, and he was hosted by Lula da Silva. It's pretty significant that Maduro met with Lula on Monday, and then on Tuesday, there was a summit of South American presidents, which we'll also touch on, which is very interesting. We just actually a few hours ago published a piece on that on Venezuela analysis. But actually, Maduro was the only one who was hosted one-on-one by Lula the day before. So this was this kind of sealing the reestablishment of diplomatic relations between Maduro and Lula, between Brazil and Venezuela. They had been broken, as you mentioned in the intro, under the Bolsonaro government, who decided, or we know why, decided to back this kind of interim government. So this has been kind of a slow and steady road that has led Venezuela back into international affairs. I wouldn't say, it depends on what we mean by isolationism. So the isolationism is over in the sense of there being governments that somehow assume that Maduro is not the president, the legitimate president of Venezuela. So that conversation is over. I mean, let's not waste any more time on that. But if we're talking about,
we have to tell Spain that, but
actually, not even Spain. Just 2 or 3 weeks ago, Venezuela announced a new ambassador in Spain, and she handed her credentials to the Spanish government. It wasn't highly publicized because, of course, it's a bit of an embarrassment. But even Spain, even Uruguay, who just now decided again to take the microphone and criticize Lula for hosting Maduro, they've also sent a new ambassador to Venezuela. So whether it's public or kept hush hush, basically the jig is up. So in terms of international relations, there's really nothing more to talk about. But there's still an isolation when we talk about sanctions, right? And Venezuela's ability to develop international trade or get foreign investment, which is very significant, right? I mean, it's not just a matter of recognition. And I guess we can talk about that in more detail. But to your point, what you mentioned in the beginning, the historical background. Chavez, I mean, he had many virtues, but one of them was really pushing for regional integration. And this is highly connected to his idea that this was a Bolivarian revolution and inheriting what had been the independence struggle led by Bolivar. And Bolivar was perhaps ahead of his time, envisioning a united continent that would be stronger to face what at the time wasn't as big a threat as it is now, but this empire in the United States that wasn't so consolidated at the time, but it already had some early signs. And actually just
but
today,
Simon Bolivar saw it coming. He saw the westward expansion and the potential threat.
Yes, he has this very ominous quote that the United States is destined to plague Latin America in the name of liberty. Just a few hours ago, there was the first seminar of a series organized by Alba Movimientos and a number of other collectives as a campaign that's called Bolivarianism against Monroeism. And
I'll put that link in the notes. Yeah. Because
so,
we touched on that. We did an episode, the audience may remember, we did an episode mid-April, actually with Carlos Ron from the Simón Bolívar Institute, about the Monroe Doctrine. And we did specifically talk briefly about Monroeism versus Bolivarism, but a full seminar on that would be really fabulous. Yeah,
so Chavez saw that, given the recent history when he was elected, I mean, this second half of the century where Latin America was plagued by military dictatorships and coups and then neoliberalism, and no single country could really face the imperialism on its own. I mean, we had the example of Cuba that had resisted against this mighty empire right next door, but to a great cost. And so regional unity would actually present a greater platform to resist imperialist meddling and then to boost a kind of sovereign development. And this had a number of different initiatives. Each of them had a different perspective and its own merits. We can talk about CELAC, which is more of a, let's say, diplomatic forum. There was ALBA, which was created as an immediate response to the ALCA, the Free Trade Agreement of the Americas, that was soundly rejected to George Bush's face in Argentina. There was Petrocaribe, which is, I mean, in my opinion, at least, a really wonderful initiative here in the Caribbean to really help these small island nations break away from their dependence on the United States. So this provided oil and fuel in very favorable conditions, sometimes in barter agreements. And it was, I mean, it's one of the reasons why Chavez is so beloved in the Caribbean, and especially in countries like Haiti. And then I left UNASUR for last, because UNASUR is perhaps the most broad-reaching initiative of them all. In fact, I would actually recommend, last year in November, after Lula came to power, and it was clear that there was really a new push for integration in the works. Guillaume Long, he was Correa's foreign minister in Ecuador. He wrote a paper on CEPR, the Center for Economic and Policy Research, arguing that relaunching UNASUR is really an important step for the region. So I would recommend that people, I can send you the link if you want to put it in the description. And there was a letter written by several former presidents and former foreign ministers, really arguing for taking up this initiative that was created in 2008, and there was a charter signed in 2011. And it was the one that had the broader reach in terms of economic, trade agreements, security, diplomacy, of course, but it also had some mechanisms that led to it becoming neutralized and then progressively dismantled. I mean, the decision-taking mechanisms were always by consensus. So as soon as this right-wing government starts to take power in the region, they just threw a spanner in the works and neutralized UNASUR, and then gradually even withdrew from UNASUR. Yeah. So now we're actually
the building in Quito's actually been sold, has it not? The
headquarters. Yeah, this was a very disgraceful step by the infamous Lenin Moreno, who got rid of the beautiful UNASUR headquarters in Quito. But step by step, we saw first Argentina and Brazil almost simultaneously declare their desire to, or their decision to rejoin UNASUR, and just a couple of days ago, Gustavo Petro said the same from Colombia. He also suggested changing the name. I didn't really get why he needed to make such a suggestion, but I guess it's within his rights. So after Lula met with Maduro, just to finish, and I'll hand the word back to you, there was a summit of these presidents in Brasilia. And what I liked about it is that it wasn't just this kind of open-ended statements that we see all the time when there are these international meetings. So Lula was very clear and said, we need a new roadmap for integration in the next 120 days, so 4 months. Yeah. And this actually suggests that something is already in the works, and it's going to be brought forward by the different countries' foreign ministers. And hopefully in the near future, we'll see what it's all about. But I would actually highlight a couple of things that Lula and the other presidents said in terms of, putting integration above ideological differences. Mm-hmm. I think this is quite interesting because, we all have our political leanings. Some are more socialist and some are less socialist. But even for governments in the center right, as long as they are not just, plain US surrogates, they will recognize that it's in their benefit to have strong regional ties. So creating trade mechanisms, for example, that are not so easily dismantled is to everyone's benefit. So I guess one of the triumphs of this meeting was actually getting everyone on the same page to do so. And then something that people really like because of its implications, and something that Lula has harped on very consistently, Maduro as well, and others, is having a different currency mechanism. We're not really sure what it would look like for regional trade to kind of take away from the hegemony of the US dollar. And when we're talking about why sanctions are so hurtful and so deadly, it's precisely because countries are dependent on the US dollar.
Yeah, it's been weaponized. The US dollar's been weaponized, and that, I think most of the audience knows this, but once you're locked out of trading or changing your domestic currency into US dollars to change globally, to trade globally, there's not much that you can do. And you're also shut out of the SWIFT banking system, which is the overnight exchange system. It's how banks move money around at the close of business. And so those two things alone, and then and then it just gets more and more strict and more expansive, the sanctions regime. But the dollar as the global currency, as the dominant global currency, has been turned into a weapon of warfare. And the Cubans know that more than anyone. The Iranians, Venezuela, Nicaragua now too, and about 30 other countries on the planet.
Yeah, indeed. When we talk about the sanctions, I'll focus on Venezuela, which is the case I'm more familiar with. When we talk about how the sanctions have worked, They have to work on different levels, but one of them is what you were just saying, you know, blocking the country from accessing this usual hegemonic trade mechanisms, the SWIFT system and so on. And so then it becomes a nightmare to do even the simplest things. So, you know, let's say the Ministry of Health wants to import vaccines, and even if it has the money, then it's a problem. It has to triangulate with some other bank. This bank may just decide that doesn't want the risk and you know, freeze the payment for 3 months, and then Venezuela doesn't get the vaccines, doesn't get the money back. It actually happened. I'm not making this up.
Yes.
It happened with the COVID-19.
We've talked about this
vaccine.
on this program.
It
with
happened.
Ivan Hugh, actually, when he was in Europe, before he became foreign minister.
Well, he knew what was up. It also happened with insulin shipments and all sorts of things, food shipments as well. So it makes this kind of current, you know, daily trading activities much more difficult. And then once you impose primary sanctions directly, so saying, you know, every U.S. agent who deals with a Venezuela state oil company or any other state entity will be face punishment, will have its assets frozen in the U.S. It becomes a problem because trade has become so globalized that it's very uncommon for, you know, big companies to not have interests here or there. So even if they don't, there are then secondary sanctions. So for a while, I hope it's not too big a detour, but for a while, after sanctions were imposed, Venezuela was trading its oil via Rosneft. So it would sell its cargoes to Rosneft at a discount, of course, and then Rosneft,
which is the Russian oil company.
Yes, partly owned by the Russian state. And then Rosneft would resell the cargoes on the global market. And then the US Treasury Department imposed secondary sanctions against Rosneft, which had to pull out, and it became much more difficult. So it forces the Venezuelan state to find this network of private intermediaries. This, of course, creates avenues for, I'm not justifying, but it creates avenues for corruption. We just recently saw a corruption scandal unveiled in the oil industry. So it hurts Venezuela in a myriad of ways. And so having different...
Well, it just makes trade so much more expensive.
Precisely.
Just the added expense alone.
Exactly. So, you know, Venezuela, if it wants to sell an oil cargo to China, you know, here are two non-US agents, and you have all these mechanisms that stop them from trading directly with each other. So Venezuela has to sell to an intermediary, then has to do a ship-to-ship transfer, relabel the oil in Malaysia, and then it finally gets to China. So a barrel that would be sold for, I don't know, $100, Venezuela ends up getting $40 on the barrel, or even having to do some kind of barter agreement that will yield even less, because, I mean, you might get the money for the oil, but then you cannot use it to import food, so you might as well do it directly. It's kind of a straitjacket on the Venezuelan economy that has left very little room for maneuver for the Maduro government. You know, it's not to say that I'm not justifying everything that is done, but this is the reality. This is the scenario in which it has to operate. So having alternative trade mechanisms, trading ecosystems, will be to the benefit not just of sanctioned countries and even private companies in sanctioned countries, but also to other countries, so that they can operate without this looming threat that they are going to be targeted for dealing with someone who has been blacklisted.
I mean, the US has basically committed what it was trying to solve. It's actually done the inverse. It's forcing people, Latin America specifically, to find an alternative to the US banking system, to the US dollar. And so with this meeting, these two meetings, Monday and Tuesday, I mean, earlier in the year, there was a meeting between Argentina and Brazil, and they had talked about creating their own currency to trade with each other. So is this an expansion of that conversation to create a regional currency, or in addition to?
Yeah, I think it's more like they are parallel plans. So I don't think it makes sense for Brazil and Argentina to wait for kind of continental setup before setting up their own, because they trade a lot with each other. And Argentina has, let's say, its own fair share of economic difficulties, and there's a big strain on its foreign reserves. They have the weight of this disastrous loan from the IMF So
that the prior president took.
Yes, talk about leaving an unhelpful present for the Fernandez government, and the Fernandez government has not really found a way to deal with it. So, having a way to deal with Brazil, which I'm guessing it's, if not the largest, one of its largest trading partners, in a way that does not put a strain on its foreign reserves, will be to Argentina's benefit. So I expect that to actually move more quickly than something. I mean, of course, then once you have that infrastructure, you can try to expand it.
Exactly.
To the continent.
It'd be like the prototype.
Exactly, like you have a model that you can then expand. There was another meeting, I think shortly after that Brazil-Argentina meeting, which was between Brazil and China, and they also floated the possibility of trading, not necessarily in a new currency, but in their own currency. So that it probably means exchanging some part of their respective foreign reserves, and then trade directly in Chinese yuan and Brazilian real.
So skipping the dollar, US dollar interchange.
Skipping the imperialist middleman.
So
it's I mean, and we're just talking about Latin America, but in other regions of the world, in the Middle East, for example, when we talk about the energy markets, Saudi Arabia, which is a big oil exporter to China as well, there have been discussions of moving away from the US dollar, which have been setting off all sorts of alarm bells in Washington, D.C. And to the other point about Venezuela joining the BRICS alliance, I don't see it as a kind of an imminent scenario, but we should understand what it means. It's of course a very important diplomatic setup, diplomatic forum, as if we understand as a counterweight to the G7, US and Europe dominated. But perhaps the most significant asset, which is very attractive to countries like Venezuela, is that the BRICS are going to have their own development bank. And we were just talking about the delicate state of the Venezuelan economy, and having access to financial, credit mechanisms outside of the, let's say, US-dominated financial system, and not even the IMF. I mean, we're talking about the Inter-American Development Bank and stuff like that. All of that is very heavily under the influence of Washington. So having a different source of financing that will allow, again, the government to plan a bit longer term, because right now it's kind of in a permanent emergency mode. How do we pay next month's wages? How do we get this next cargo exported? So having some breathing room to, again, address significant infrastructure issues, plan more in the long term, restart credit for agricultural producers, stuff like that. That's the allure of joining the BRICS, beyond giving away to this kind of multi-polarity effort.
But it's a strong message to the quote unquote international community, the West, that there's so many countries now, particularly in the global South, that are interested in joining BRICS and publicly saying that in the international press. And that alone is creating a narrative, a really strong one. And so now to have Maduro mention the same earlier in the week, it's like, well, it's one more,
Not only did he mention it, but he was also, Lula was, expressed his favorable opinion in that regard. And I think it goes to show kind of a clash between development models. When we talk about the US influence in the world and the alternatives, and of course the biggest one is the Chinese one. China has investments and cooperation agreements all around the world. I'm not going to romanticize what Chinese investment means. Of course, it also has its issues, but it does not cause the kind of political strain and the political blackmail that we usually associate with the IMF and the World Bank when we talk about countries in the global South, in Latin America or in Africa. So in that regard, it shouldn't really be a surprise that countries want to look for the most favorable, development, cooperation, what have you, trade mechanisms that they can access. And it's clear that this will be outside the sphere of influence of the US and to a lesser extent, the European Union. What perhaps this tells us on a more global context is that there's a real reduction of the projection of US power worldwide. So the US, there are plenty of examples. I mean, we shouldn't really go into Afghanistan and all of that, but plenty of examples that show that this era of unipolarity, the end of history, all of that came after the fall of the Berlin Wall, this era is over. So the US cannot just impose its will and change government as it pleases. So there are now other actors around the world which might not be as powerful to directly challenge the US by themselves, but they are powerful enough to understand that they can create alternative development and trading and diplomatic routes that inevitably will challenge Washington's hegemony.
Well, this is really to me, I think that's key, and this is one of the things that's so important, I think, as we watch this integration of Latin America and the Caribbean become more articulated and seeing it actually unfold. It's like as each nation steps up and says, here's what we want, here's the national sovereignty we want to protect, the natural resource sovereignty we want to protect, we want our own economic model. As each one stands up, more stand up. I mean, you can just see there really is this strength being created among the nations of Latin America and the Caribbean. I know, we did an episode on the CELAC summit from September of 2021 here in Mexico City. And really, it really was AMLO's call that needed to happen. And you can just really see it, every day unfolding. And it's very, it's encouraging. And of course, other people will say, well, yes, but this is also when the US becomes the most aggressive, when Latin America starts liberating itself. And we saw that during Plan Condor and in the 80s as well, specifically in Central America.
Yeah, I was just going to mention that it's not like the US is going to take this sitting down. So
No.
these countries and we as journalists, activists, we should be prepared for their reaction. And I mean, we see, for example, when it comes to sanctions, that there's not really a softening of US sanctions. Rather, the US is seeing how it can continue to use these weapons to kind of blackmail not just the Venezuelan government, but also Cuba, Nicaragua, and even third parties. So when we talk about the advantages of integration, I remember that in late 2020, Venezuela struck an oil for food agreement with a couple of Mexican companies.
Yeah.
And then these were targeted by Washington, and this swap deal had to be nixed. But as you create this kind of stronger ecosystem for trading in the continent, I mean, one of the things that Maduro mentioned was reactivating. There's the biggest source of Venezuelan energy, which is the Guri Dam, is very close to the border with Brazil. And it used to supply electricity to Roraima, which is the northernmost state of Brazil along the border with Venezuela. And Maduro mentioned,
a lot of people don't know that Venezuela provides electricity to that part of Brazil.
And actually, Venezuela's electricity struggles have also meant electricity struggles in this province of Brazil, which is in the Amazon and very hard to reach and to do significant infrastructure work. So Maduro said, if Brazil, as either its government or private actors are ready to bring the investment, we can reactivate this electricity supply to Roraima. So this is a case of, Brazilian companies are not forbidden of doing this, right? That there's nothing in the US Treasury sanctions that says they cannot do it, but they might be reluctant to do it if they fear they're going to be targeted by US sanctions. So if there's let's say an atmosphere,
that's what we call that over compliance.
precisely.
Right.
So agents that are not necessarily doing anything wrong, quote unquote. Not that it would be wrong in the first place, but they fear being targeted. So if there's an atmosphere where, here you have the Brazilian government directly backing these kinds of deals, they might be more inclined to do them, and it will be to their benefit. I mean, it will be to the benefit of the region to have this kind of electricity supply reactivated. So that's just one example of how things can change. So there might not be a change to the sanctions policy, but there might be a change to the US's ability to enforce them. So whereas maybe 3 years ago, when Venezuela was more isolated, the US Treasury Department would be more confident to just go after some Brazilian companies. Now it might be more difficult. It might really hurt them in the long run to do so. It might actually push the Brazil towards the quote unquote the arms of China. So it changes it little by little changes the equation altogether and puts I hope people will forgive me for centering everything on Venezuela, but it
well, no, that's why you're here.
and other target nations in a better position to kind of circumvent sanctions, get more room to maneuver, and hopefully kickstart their own economies.
Well, it's all so encouraging, and I think maybe let's talk a little bit specifically about the Brazilian president's vision, Lula da Silva, back in office. His vision, I mean, he's basically re-embraced Brazil's role as an international player, and he's quite good at that, and he's rapidly embraced that role again back in the presidency. And and like you said earlier, he's immediately, not as immediate as Petro, but pretty fast, recognized, reestablished diplomatic relations with Venezuela, overtly recognized Maduro as the democratically elected president of Venezuela, and has just set the stage. This is the dialogue we're going to have. These are the countries that make up Latin America and the Caribbean. These are their respected elected presidents, and that's a big deal for Brazil specifically, being the largest country in in South America. That's a huge step for him. And it's not just a message to Latin America and the Caribbean. It's a message to the entire hemisphere and to the rest of the world.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this article that I was mentioning by Guillaume Long in the beginning, when I was talking about UNASUR, he made it very clear that regional integration efforts historically have been driven by Brazil, and it's no coincidence. I mean, this is the largest economy, the largest country in the region, so it makes perfect sense. And as you were saying, it's actually very encouraging to see Lula embrace that role and actually waste no time. I mean, he just got into office.
It was like immediately.
There are always these arguments that you shouldn't pick too many fights at once, but he has decided life's too short. He knew. I mean, he was very aware of what happened in just a few years between not him leaving office, but the coup against Dilma, just the damage that a single term of someone like Bolsonaro can do. So there's no time to waste, and so that's why he says 120 days. Let's get this done. Let's get this moving. And let's make sure that this is not so delicate, so not so vulnerable to the political whims of whoever is in office, and not just Latin America. I mean, we don't have time to discuss this, but also when it comes to Ukraine, and this has really riled up U.S. officials, that Lula is not just echoing the U.S. line. And it's funny to those of us on the outside how he just says the most perfectly reasonable things. Russia was responding to an actual threat on its doorstep, and U.S. officials just go crazy. How dare someone say that? And the same thing here. There was this sentence that he said when he was doing the joint presser with Maduro that was picked up by the media, and then also by these, let's say, opportunist presidents, Uruguay and Chile as well. He said that there was a narrative created that Venezuela was somehow an authoritarian, anti-democratic state. And I mean, of course, it's a narrative. It's completely absurd. There's no way you can challenge the legitimacy of the 2018 presidential election. And so it was indeed a narrative created by Washington and then echoed by these very subservient media outlets that served to justify, on one hand, these murderous economic sanctions, and on the other, this now extinct circus called interim government. So it's like saying reasonable things has become an issue. So to wrap up, it has really been a welcome sight. I was, let's say, one of the pessimists when it came to Lula and other progressive governments in the region. Let me explain why. Because they are coming back to power in a more delicate, let's say, global economic context than when, let's say, the first progressive wave came in the 2000s. So the big question is, were the lessons of the past learned? Of course, I mean, this region was targeted by attacks from the US all the time, but there were also, you know, their own mistakes that need to be, things that need to be done differently this time around. So the early signs, both from Petro and now especially from Lula, are that the lessons have indeed been learned. You know, I was saying no time to waste, and both of them, and Lula to a greater extent because of Brazil's projection, have been very assertive in the international sphere.
They have, and you know, it's really encouraging because sitting here in Mexico City, a lot of us really love the message that the Mexican president is sending to Latin America and the Caribbean. But it's also going to be really important that he have others standing beside him and others to carry the baton. I mean, we have elections here in Mexico next year, and you know, per the Constitution, president can only serve for 1 6-year term. So there's going to need to be more voices, and that seems to be happening. And like we were saying earlier, you know, as each country stands up and asserts itself more, and everybody becomes more unified, and it's really this desire to create a bloc, and specifically an economic bloc with a sovereign currency, is really encouraging, really encouraging. And I think it's also important, as you said earlier, that there is a tendency to say among the diversity of leaders in Latin America and the Caribbean that the domestic affairs are to each country, its elected government and its citizens, and everybody has to kind of step out of that and work together on the external, on the foreign policy, the trade, and the economic issues. And I don't think I've ever seen that in my lifetime in the region. It's really exciting.
Indeed, I mean, I think in the end they are not separate issues when we're talking about, you know, for example, the economic aspect. Because if a country is just by itself, it will trade in, let's say, very unfavorable conditions with a partner like the United States or the European Union or even China. If there's a broader integration that can, for example, relieve the need to get inputs from the US when you can get them from Brazil and they are much cheaper, it will gradually reduce their dependence. And if it reduces their dependence, it means that they can negotiate in stronger conditions. And to your point, we should actually say that AMLO was actually the first one, or the first major player who challenged the isolation against Venezuela. Yeah. So there was this gradual re-election of leftist progressive leaders in Latin America. We saw AMLO in Mexico and then Alberto Fernandez in Argentina. But AMLO, who is actually, you know, the closest one, you know, so close, so far from God and so close to the United States, right? That's so yeah. You know, he feels the breath on the back of his neck. And he was the one who actually took this stance and said, you know, it makes no sense. We cannot just be handpicking interim leaders like that. And he invited Maduro to this summit. He was actually the one who gave like an electric shock to bring CELAC back to life. It hadn't gathered for a number of years, even before the pandemic. 4 years. Yeah. So to his credit, his vision of integration is perhaps a bit more conservative than Brazil's. When we talk about regional currency and all of that, he hasn't sounded as sold on the idea. Of course, he knows. I mean, he had the NAFTA deal. he knows the importance of finding trade mechanisms that do not subjugate countries like his. But to his credit, he has also been one of the major actors in challenging this U.S. hegemony, which seemed unchallenged in the continent for such a long time.
Yeah, he's been very overt about it, and was really wonderful when he reconvened CELAC, and after it was 4 years, I think, Ricardo, a 4-year pause, they refer to it. And it was after he gave that really fantastic speech in July of 2021 on the 238th anniversary of Simón Bolívar's birth, and pretty much laid it all out. He did a beautiful, talk about Simón Bolívar, the man, the history, the vision for the Americas, and it just segued beautifully into the current need to rebuild the OAS and or get rid of it, and the full integration of the Americas. And he was very overt in having in inviting Maduro to attend as the elected president of Venezuela. He was very, very clear about that when the invitations were extended, and Díaz-Canel of Cuba, and inviting Nicaragua, and just showing that full integration of elected governments in the hemisphere. It was really, really clear. And
actual governments, not just
pretending. The governments that the people elected, and not the governments appointed by the United States. So it was really pretty exciting, and just to continue watching it all unfold. And now with Brazil being so visible and vocal in the hemisphere and around the world, it's really, really significant what's continuing to unfold and grow. So regarding Monday's meeting, is there anything that we've left out that we should share with the audience?
No, I think we pretty much covered it. Perhaps just a final point that both presidents made. Maduro, of course, always talks about sanctions, and sometimes it feels like no one wants to talk about sanctions, and that means that they've gone away. They haven't. Yeah. They're still there, and they're still hampering everything that's related to Venezuela and its day-to-day life. I mean, there's really no aspect of life here that's not hurt by sanctions. And Lula was also very critical in saying that you cannot just impose economic sanctions on the country because you don't like its leader. That's not really how it works. And actually, to give perhaps undeserved props to Gabriel Boric, maybe it's the first and only time it will happen on this podcast. So Boric had these very opportunist comments about it's not a narrative, the human rights issues are real, which is not what Lula said at all. He just took it out of context to score some cheap political points. But to his credit, he said that it's a welcome sight for Maduro to take part in these multilateral organizations and to discuss these things directly with him. He talked about the border and the migration issue, and he also said sanctions have to be lifted without any preconditions. So I said, I was telling someone that Boric actually read the room and realized that he needed to say something a bit more along those lines. So,
yeah, and he did.
And he did. We'll see if he changes tune next time around. But for now, I think it was overall for knowing who he is, it was positive.
So, well, more positive news for Venezuela. So hopefully we'll just keep, getting stronger and stronger, and more support, and more throughout the hemisphere and the rest of the world. And the meeting Monday was really, really encouraging, for many of us outside of Brazil and Venezuela to see. It was really a very encouraging. We were happy to hear about the invitation extended to Brazil. Extended from Brazil to Venezuela, and then to see it actually become a reality. It was a really, really significant news event for the hemisphere. So thank you, Ricardo. Is there anything that we should say in closing? I'm just so happy to have had your time today and to work with you.
It was my pleasure. I'll actually take the opportunity to plug in some Venezuela analysis content.
Do please.
We actually have a sanctions booklet in the works. So we have produced a lot of content on sanctions, their consequences, how they work, the media coverage around them, and also perhaps what's most dear to us is, the efforts by grassroots, the popular organizations, to fight back, to take matters into their own hands and to construct socialism from the ground up. So it will be a booklet that we'll hope will be available in a month or two, that will have lots of great content on sanctions that we hope will be useful for solidarity movements. And also, if we're talking about the regional integration, we have an infographic called Bolivarianism against Monroeism. I think someone stole our name for this campaign. And I would encourage people to, we actually need to update because we have the member countries and we need to add Brazil and Argentina. So that's one of several infographics we have been producing in recent times. We have some great graphic designers working with us. So not just that, we also have infographics on the economy, on sanctions, on the Venezuelan communes. So that's something that we also encourage. I think it's a useful way to have kind of a neat and compact content that can be easily spread on social media and other
So
channels.
where can we find those infographics?
There if you go to our website and you look at the section that's called images, you'll see the list of infographics there. The latest one was on Citgo, which is a very important asset that's actually facing some very important threats right now. And this infographic actually retells the story of how a deadly combination of sanctions and collusion from the Venezuelan opposition has led to this, imminent danger.
So I will, for the audience, in the program notes are social media links for Ricardo and for Venezuela Analysis and the Venezuela Analysis website, so that you can go straight there and look under images for these infographics. And then also I've included in the program notes the article on this meeting earlier this week between Venezuela and Brazil. The article was actually written by Jose Luis Granados, who is a reporter for Venezuela Analysis, and Ricardo is an editor, so in Caracas. So very happy to have you with us this evening. And Ricardo, we'll have to have you come back when your sanctions booklet is published. And
definitely, I would be delighted. Okay,
that would be fabulous. So let's stay in touch about that, and we can promote the booklet and do an educational broadcast as well. It'd be really great. So thank you again. For the audience, you should just know that Ricardo is a personal friend, and I have not worked with him since we last saw each other in Venezuela. So it was really a pleasure that you could join us for this episode, Ricardo, and I hope to see you in Venezuela soon. So
yeah, pleasure was all mine. Great to see you, Terry.
Let me just remind the audience that you've been watching What the F is Going On in Latin America and the Caribbean. We broadcast on YouTube live every Thursday, 7:30 p.m. Eastern. You can find us on the following YouTube channels: The Convo Couch, Code Pink, and Popular Resistance. Post-broadcast recordings can be found on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. So thank you, everyone, and we will see you next week.